Stocking up on chips, candy bars, and drive-through burgers feels like a modern indulgence, the guilty pleasure of a busy age. But humanity's love affair with quick, salty, greasy, and sometimes downright questionable snacks. That's far older than the golden arches or the crinkly sound of a potato chip bag. In medieval Europe, when kings sat on thrones and peasants huddled in drafty tenements, a different kind of fast food culture thrived. Street-side cooks sold steaming pies, fried dough, and honey-drizzled fritters, but with ingredients and hygiene that could turn your stomach, or worse. Imagine meat pies stuffed with diseased pork, sweet pastries hiding the taste of rot, and alcohol flowing like water to wash it all down. This wasn't just food. It was survival, status, and sometimes scandal on a plate. And today, we're going to walk the crowded streets, step into the smoky cookshops, and discover exactly what junk food meant in the Middle Ages. Would you eat it? More importantly, could you survive it? For more stories like this video and subscribe to our channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we learn about history together from all around the world. If medieval people didn't have kitchens or the money to cook at home, where did they go when hunger struck? The answer takes us to the heart of the medieval city. The cookshops, medieval takeout in a world without kitchens. If you lived in medieval London, hunger wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a daily threat. And if you were poor, which most people were, your home probably couldn't keep you fed even if you wanted to cook for yourself. Imagine waking up in a cramped wooden tenement wedged between dozens of others, the air heavy with damp, the floor littered with straw, and the smell of yesterday's unwashed bodies clinging to the rafters. Your home might be a single room, shared with your family, maybe another lodger, and certainly with rats. You don't have a fireplace, you don't have a kitchen, you don't even have a chimney. If you tried to light a cooking fire indoors, the smoke would choke you long before the meal was ready, assuming it didn't burn the whole building down. And then there's cost. Firewood and charcoal aren't cheap, and cooking pots or pans. For many, they were luxuries passed down like heirlooms. So where did Londoners get their meals? They went to the streets. The birth of the cookshop. The solution was a place known as the cookshop. A small, smoky, usually open-fronted kitchen where meals were sold hot and ready to eat. They were the medieval answer to the takeout window, and they could be found clustered along the busiest thoroughfares of the city, especially near the Thames. Some were permanent stalls, others were little more than a table, a brazier, and a pot of stew simmering over embers. What made them special was not the luxury of the food, because most of it wasn't luxurious at all, but the accessibility. These shops were open every day, some of them all night, serving whoever could pay, the dock worker at dawn, the labourer at midday, the drunk staggering home at midnight. The menus changed with the seasons. In winter you might get thick pottage, a stew of peas, beans, root vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat could be spared. In summer there were lighter dishes, bread, soft cheese, perhaps some fruit if you were lucky, but there was always something hot, always something ready to eat. A sensory marketplace. Walk down Thames Street in the 14th century and you would know exactly where the cookshops were, long before you could see them. The smell hit fee. First, Bristol's famed Watch Cook's Row was notorious for this. Shopkeepers would throw meat onto the fire not because it was ordered, but because the scent would drift into the street, curling into the noses of passers-by. Smoke and roasting fat. That was medieval marketing. And it worked. Hungry travellers would stop, coins clinking in their hands, drawn in by the promise of something warm and filling. In an age before neon signs or glossy adverts, scent was the sales pitch. What was on the menu? Cookshops sold more than just stews. There were meat pies, fried fish, pancakes, fresh bread, sometimes sweet treats for those who could afford them. Some specialised. One might be famous for its poultry, another for its fried eel, another for cakes. Others were generalists, offering whatever the day's market provided. If you couldn't afford much, you might buy just a slab of bread, not to eat alone, but to sop up the stew your neighbour might share. If you had a little more, you could get a pie to take home, wrapped in cloth, eaten cold by candlelight. More than food, a social space. These weren't just places to eat, they were places to hear the news, swap gossip, and strike deals. A dock worker might hear about a new cargo arriving, a traveller could find a guide, a merchant could meet a buyer. Just as coffee houses would become the nerve centres of 17th century London, cookshops in the Middle Ages were hubs of their own kind, louder, smokier, rougher, but no less important. The risk on your plate. Of course, there was a darker side. Food safety was not a concept that existed in the way we know it today. Leftovers were reused. Meat was kept long past freshness. In times of scarcity, this was survival, and customers often didn't ask too many questions. And yet people kept coming back because hunger was the greater danger. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread was stronger than the fear of a bad stomach. One item sold in these shops became the undisputed champion of medieval fast food. Portable, filling, and cheap, it was the go-to snack for centuries. But behind its popularity lurked a secret that could make you sick, or even kill you. What was it? And why did so many risk eating it anyway? The meat pie, comfort food or culinary trap? It was small enough to hold in one hand, warm enough to fight off the chill of an English morning, heavy enough to make you feel, for a short while, that your stomach was full. The meat pie was the undisputed king of medieval street food. It was the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a hamburger, portable, cheap, and popular with everyone from dock workers to soldiers to drunken students spilling out of taverns. But unlike a hamburger, you didn't always want to know what was inside. The appeal of the pie, for the average Londoner, a meat pie was the perfect quick meal. Wrapped in pastry, it kept the contents warm and could be eaten on the move, whether that move was down the muddy streets of Cheapside or along the docks of the Thames. Pastry was more than a container. In a world without Tupperware or plastic wrap, a thick crust acted like a medieval lunchbox. You could carry it for hours without worrying too much about dirt or flies, at least not any more than usual in a city already crawling with them. They were sold at all hours. Dock hands could buy one at dawn before heading to work. Labourers could grab one during the midday break. Even nobles' servants might sneak to a cookshop for one on their errands. It was the food of the people. What was inside? Here's where things get interesting and dangerous. In the ideal world of the wealthy, the filling might be fresh pork, chicken, or beef mixed with onions, herbs, maybe even imported spices for those who could afford them. But for the average street buyer, reality was less appetizing. Medieval records, like a 13th century report from Norwich, tell us that some cooks weren't just cutting corners, they were cutting into diseased pork. Meat that should have been thrown away was diced up, heavily seasoned to mask the taste, and baked into pies. If it was already rancid, a generous helping of salt or pepper could trick the tongue for long enough to make the sale. Reheated until rotten. And it wasn't just bad meat. In an age without refrigeration, leftovers were a gamble. A pie that didn't sell on Monday might be warmed up and sold again on Tuesday, or Wednesday, or later. There are accounts of pies reheated days after they'd been baked, their fillings sour, but still marketable to the desperate. In truth, many buyers probably suspected. They simply didn't have the luxury of caring. Hunger dulled the instinct for caution. The devil in the kitchen, the risk was so notorious that it birthed a saying, God sends the meat, but the devil sends the cooks. It was a grim joke, one that summed up the way medieval people saw their world. Food was a blessing from God. What happened to it in the kitchen was another matter entirely. Why people ate them anyway. Scarcity forces choices that no one would make in times of abundance. A day's work in the docks or fields burned calories fast. You needed something filling, something hot, and something cheap. Meat pies checked all three boxes. If the risk was food poisoning, well, that was a risk you could deal with tomorrow. Hunger was today's problem. A note on spices and preservation. Spices weren't just for flavor. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, imported at great cost from Asia, could disguise the smell of meat long past its prime. To the wealthy, spices were a status symbol. To the poor, they were a lifeline, if they could afford them at all. Salt, the great preserver, played a similar role, but it was expensive, too, and often used sparingly in street food. Most pies relied on fast sale rather than long preservation, and when sales were slow, corners were cut. If a meat pie was too risky, there was another option, a way to get a hot meal without even needing a plate. It was a medieval innovation that filled bellies, saved money, and became a symbol of luck and faith. What was it, and why did the church approve of it? Bread bowls, trenchers, and the rise of the carb. If the meat pie was the medieval hamburger, then bread was everything else. It was the plate, the spoon, the container, the filler, and often the only thing between you and an empty stomach. In a world where grain was the foundation of survival, medieval bakers weren't just selling loaves, they were feeding an entire system of portable, carb-heavy meals, and some of their inventions were ingenious. When bread was your bowl, imagine walking into a London bakery in the 14th century. The air is thick with the smell of yeast and wood smoke. Behind the counter, a baker stands in front of a wide, glowing oven, a luxury that almost no one in the neighborhood has at home. You hand over a hunk of meat you've bought from the market. The baker doesn't just bake it as it is. Instead, he wraps it in dough, sealing it inside a crust that will cook through in the heat. An hour later, you've got a meal that's hot, portable, and protected from the grime of the street. This practice was so common that the City of London eventually had to step in. In 1350, the city passed a law saying bakers couldn't charge more than a penny to bake a customer's meat. They could make bread all day long, but they weren't allowed to gouge their neighbours for the service. The trencher, edible tableware. Then there was the trencher, an edible plate made from stale or thick-cut bread. At feasts, meat and stew were piled on top of the trencher, soaking it with fat and juices. Once the meal was over, the trenchers could be eaten by the diners, given to servants, or distributed to the poor. It was the ultimate waste-not solution, a dish you could eat, a belly filler that doubled as charity, and a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even table scraps could mean the difference between life and death. Bread as a social divider, but not all bread was created equal. The rich ate fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour, soft, pale, and expensive. The poor got coarse, dark loaves made from rye, barley, or oats, often mixed with whatever filler was available, including pea flour or even ground-up beans. The difference was visible and symbolic. Bread was more than food. It was a mark of your place in the world. The pretzel, holy snack or street food. Then there was the pretzel. Yes, the same twisted snack you find at fairs and shopping malls today. In medieval Europe, pretzels were made from just 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. This made them perfect for Lent, when Christians were forbidden to eat meat, dairy, or eggs. Monks often baked pretzels and handed them out to children who had learned their prayers. In some regions, they were given to the poor as a gesture of charity. The pretzel's shape, some historians say, represented arms folded in prayer. Whether or not that's true, the association with luck and piety stuck. A pretzel in your hand wasn't just a snack, it was a symbol of God's blessing, and a little superstition never hurt the appetite. Bread as comfort, bread as control, bread filled more than bellies. It was a tool of control. In bad harvest years, rulers feared bread riots more than almost anything else. Shortages could spark unrest overnight. Cities kept grain reserves for this reason, not out of kindness but out of fear. When bread prices soared, unrest followed, and when bread was plentiful, so was the peace. But bread alone couldn't lift a person's spirits. In the cold months, or during the long fasting days of Lent, people craved something stronger, something that could warm the body and cloud the mind. What was medieval Europe drinking, and why were religious leaders so worried about it? Booze, fasting, and the strange case of the mock egg. Bread could fill your stomach. Meat pies could keep you going. But for many medieval Europeans, true comfort, the kind that warmed the chest and loosened the tongue, came from a cup. And not just any cup, a cup filled with beer, ale, or wine. In fact, alcohol was so woven into daily life that some people drank more of it than water. And with good reason. In many places, the water could kill you. Why alcohol was the safer choice? Medieval towns and cities were crowded, filthy, and badly drained. Human waste and animal waste flowed into the same rivers people used for drinking water. Wells could be contaminated without anyone realizing it. A single bad source could spread disease through an entire neighborhood. Alcohol, beer, ale, cider, and wine, was boiled or fermented during production. This killed many of the dangerous microbes that lurked in untreated water. It wasn't perfectly safe, but it was safer, and that meant adults, children, and even the sick were often drinking alcohol daily. Everyday drinking. Beer was the drink of the working classes, thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, enough to quench thirst without knocking you flat. Alehouses dotted the streets, serving locals who came for a pint and stayed for conversation. Wine was the drink of the wealthy and of regions with warmer climates. In England, wine was mostly imported, expensive, prized, and symbolic of status. Cider, mead, and other fermented brews filled the gaps. No matter the form, the habit was the same. If you were thirsty, you drank. The loophole of Lent, then came Lent. 40 days of fasting, abstaining from meat, and, in theory, practicing self-denial. Theory, because while the church restricted certain foods, alcohol was often treated differently. For some, beer and wine became the loophole that made fasting bearable. Meat was banned, but drink wasn't, at least not officially in most places. and so people filled the gap in their diets with more pints, more cups, more flagons. By the late 14th century, this practice had become so common that some religious figures were furious. In 1400, the Benedictine monk Robert Ripon railed against what he saw as hypocrisy, people who, he claimed, got more drunk during Lent than at any other time of year. When faith and food collided, this tension between religious rules and everyday cravings didn't just play out in taverns, it also shaped the foods people ate and the creative ways they bent the rules. Enter one of the strangest inventions of the medieval kitchen, the mock egg. The mock egg, a fasting illusion. During Lent, eggs were forbidden, but that didn't stop medieval cooks from making something that looked like one. The recipe was clever. Take empty eggshells, fill them with a paste made of almond milk, jelly, and crushed almonds. Dye the mixture yellow so it resembled a yolk. Serve it just like a real egg. It wasn't meat, it wasn't dairy, and yet it gave the eater the familiar experience of cracking open an egg and finding something rich inside. Some saw it as harmless creativity, others saw it as cheating, but for the hungry and for those desperate for something familiar, the mock egg was a small act of rebellion against the strict calendar of the church. The role of alcohol in fasting seasons. Drinking during Lent wasn't always about indulgence. For laborers and the poor, alcohol was also a source of calories. A thick ale could replace a meal, keeping a person on their feet when solid food was scarce. Still, the church worried. Drunkenness wasn't just a sin of the flesh, it was a doorway to other sins. And in towns where alehouses were packed, shoulder to shoulder, that doorway was wide open. But if the church worried about drink, it also had a stake in another craving, sweetness. Sugar was rare, honey was precious. Yet medieval Europe developed a surprisingly rich culture of sweet treats long before refined sugar became common. How did they do it, and what did those early desserts taste like? Sweetness without sugar, honeyed delights and carnival foods. Today, if you want something sweet, it's as easy as opening a cupboard or walking into the nearest shop. Chocolate bars, gummy candies, cookies, cheap, abundant, and ready to devour. But in the Middle Ages, sweetness was rare. Refined sugar was so expensive it was measured by the ounce, locked away in chests like treasure, and reserved for the tables of kings, bishops, and merchants rich enough to own their own ships. For everyone else, sweetness had to come from somewhere else, and that somewhere was the beehive. Honey. The king of medieval sweetness, honey was the primary sweetener for most of Europe. Monasteries kept beehives not just for wax to make candles, but for the golden liquid that could turn even the most basic food into a treat. The poor might only taste honey a few times a year, at fairs, feast days, or weddings, but the cooks and bakers who sold street food learned quickly. If you could drizzle a little honey over a humble piece of fried dough, you could charge more for it. The street sweets of the Middle Ages, one of the most beloved honeyed snacks was the fritter. A popular 14th century Venetian recipe called for apples, saffron, flour and honey. A warm, fragrant combination that was more than just a snack. It was a small piece of luxury in the palm of your hand. The saffron alone, one of the most expensive spices in the world, turned the fritters a golden color that shouted wealth and celebration. For those who couldn't afford saffron and fresh fruit, there were cheaper versions, dough stuffed with crushed ginger and almonds, topped with honey or even beet juice for color. Gingerbread, spicy, sweet, and symbolic. Another medieval favorite was gingerbread, though it looked nothing like the iced cookies we know today. Medieval gingerbread was dense, almost cake-like, made by mixing breadcrumbs with honey, ginger, cloves, and pepper. That pepper wasn't a mistake. Spices in medieval Europe were symbols of wealth, and adding them to a sweet treat was a way to show off. It was sweet, spicy, and exotic, a bite-sized reminder that your city was connected to the far-off markets of Asia. The medieval carnival treat, crisps. If you've ever had funnel cake at a fair, you've had a taste of a medieval tradition. Back then they were called crisps, flat, fried cakes of dough dusted with sugar or drizzled with honey. Because sugar was scarce, crisps were a special occasion food. You might eat one during a festival or carnival, when cooks could justify splurging on the rare sweet ingredient. And just like modern fair food, they were greasy, sticky, and meant to be eaten with your fingers. The perfect street indulgence. Desserts of necessity and invention. Sweetness wasn't always about luxury. Sometimes it was a way to make unappealing foods palatable. Take the fritter of milk, essentially fried, sweetened cottage cheese. It might not have been a child's dream dessert, but it was high in protein, cheap to make, and easy to dress up with honey. For poor families, it was a way to turn leftovers into something that felt like a treat, even if it was a stretch to call it one. Waffles. Before waffles, waffles too have medieval roots, though their earliest form came from ancient Greece, where obelios were simple flat cakes cooked between metal plates. By the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had made its own version, thin flour wafers often stamped with biblical scenes. These were given out on holy days, more a symbol of faith than a snack. But after the Crusades, a richer, sweeter waffle, batter began circulating in Europe with honey, cinnamon, and cream. By the 15th century, Dutch bakers had introduced the now iconic grid pattern, creating little pockets perfect for catching syrup centuries later. The psychological pull of sweetness. In an age where life was hard and most meals were bland, sweetness was more than flavor. It was an escape. A honeyed fritter wasn't just food. It was a momentary illusion of abundance, a taste that told your senses, for now, you are not poor, you are not cold, you are not hungry, you are indulged. And that desire, that need for indulgence, would grow even stronger when the world's most addictive sweetener finally arrived in bulk. Because in the 16th century, something happened that would change Europe's diet forever. Sugar became cheap, and with it came an explosion of desserts, and an entirely new idea of what a meal should end with. How did it happen? And what did it cost the world to satisfy Europe's sweet tooth? The sugar revolution and the birth of dessert. For centuries, the poor of Europe sweetened their lives with honey, and the rich with carefully rationed lumps of imported sugar. It was precious, it was rare, and then, in a single century, it became common. The change didn't just transform the medieval diet, it reshaped global trade, built empires, and spilled more blood than any dessert recipe should ever be connected to. The flood of sugar. The turning point came in the late 15th and early 16th centuries when European powers, Spain, Portugal, later England, France, and the Netherlands, began expanding across the Atlantic. The New World wasn't just about gold or silver, it was about land, vast stretches of fertile ground in climates perfect for sugarcane. On Caribbean islands in Brazil and along the coasts of Central America, Europeans established enormous plantations. And to work those plantations, they relied on one of the darkest systems in history, the transatlantic slave trade. The demand for sugar was so great that millions of enslaved Africans were shipped across the ocean, forced to labor under brutal conditions, harvesting and processing cane in heat and danger that killed many within years. Every sweet mouthful in Europe had its price, and it was paid in human lives. London's sugar boom. By the mid-1500s, sugar was arriving in Europe in quantities unimaginable a century before. London even opened its own sugar refinery, a building where raw cane could be processed into the white, crystalline product that was quickly becoming an obsession. Suddenly, what had once been a delicacy reserved for royalty could be bought in small amounts by ordinary households. And from that moment, Europe's relationship with food changed. Sugar everywhere. It wasn't just in cakes and candies. Sugar began appearing in meats, roasted game glazed with sugar syrup, fish served with sweet sauces, vegetables, peas and carrots tossed with sugar to improve their flavor, fruit preserved in syrup or crystallized into jewel-like candies. Cooks experimented with combinations that would seem bizarre to modern tastes, but to a medieval palate, sugar was a miracle ingredient. It could make even the roughest food taste like wealth. New stars of the sweet table. With sugar in their hands, bakers and cooks invented, or reinvented, dozens of recipes. Cusquinoles, sweet ravioli filled with fruit or nut pastes dusted with sugar. Sugared crusts, pies topped with layers of sugar before baking. Berry tarts, fruit on a crisp pastry base glazed to glisten in candlelight. These were the desserts of the emerging middle class who used them to signal that they had joined the ranks of those who could afford luxury. The word dessert enters the language. Before the sugar boom, most medieval meals ended with something plain, maybe fruit, cheese, or nuts. The idea of ending with a dedicated sweet course didn't exist for most people. That changed as sugar became more available. The French began using the word desservir, meaning to clear the table, as a way to describe the final course, a small, sweet dish after the main meal. By the mid-16th century, the English had borrowed the term, and dessert became part of the language. It was more than a new word, it was a new expectation that every proper meal should end with something sweet. The consequences of indulgence, but sweetness had its price, even for those who never saw the plantations. By the 17th century, European dentists were recording a surge in tooth decay among the wealthy. The more sugar you could afford, the more likely you were to lose your teeth, a strange, almost ironic badge of status. And yet, no one stopped. Sugar wasn't just a flavor anymore, it was a symbol of power, prosperity, and connection to the vast web of trade that was reshaping the world. We've walked through the cookshops, eaten the pies, sipped the ale, and tasted the sweets. But what does all of this, the indulgence, the risk, the innovation, really tell us about the people of the Middle Ages? And if you were suddenly dropped into a medieval city, would you dare eat what they called fast food? The final chapter brings it all together. What medieval junk food tells us about the people who ate it? We've followed the smells of roasting meat through the crowded streets of London. We've bitten into meat pies that could either fill your belly or send you running for a bucket. We've dipped trenchers into thick stews, nibbled pretzels given by monks, sipped ale during Lent, and tasted honey-drizzled fritters that would disappear in 2 bites. We've watched sugar sweep across the world like an unstoppable tide, sweetening everything in its path, even as it brought suffering to millions. But what do all these foods actually mean? They're more than recipes, they're windows into a world where eating was an act of survival, a declaration of faith, and sometimes a gamble with your life. Survival first, taste second. In the Middle Ages, most people didn't eat for pleasure, they ate because they had to. A meat pie was popular not because it was delicious, but because it was cheap, portable, and filling. A trencher was practical because you didn't need a plate, and you could eat it afterward. Sweetness wasn't about indulgence. It was about using precious honey or sugar to mask the taste of something less appealing. Food was never guaranteed. Bad harvests, war, or plague could empty markets overnight. People learned to eat what was available, whether it was fresh, spoiled, or entirely fake, like a mock egg during Lent. Food as a social divider. What you ate and how you ate it marked your place in the world. Fine white bread meant you were wealthy. Coarse rye or barley meant you were not. Imported spices on your meat pie were a luxury. But for the poor, even a pinch of pepper could be a miracle. A banquet in a noble hall was a performance of wealth, just as much as a modern celebrity's Instagram dinner post. Street food, on the other hand, was the great equalizer, eaten by servants, travelers, and anyone who could spare a coin. Faith and food, a constant negotiation. The church shaped what people could and couldn't eat, especially during fasting periods. But human ingenuity always found loopholes: pretzels for Lent, mock eggs, alcohol in place of meat. The rules were followed, in spirit, if not in letter. These substitutions tell us something profound. No matter how strict the law, people will always find a way to preserve the little pleasures that make life worth living. The psychology of eating in the Middle Ages, when life was short and uncertain, a hot pie in your hands or a sweet fries. Teeter on your tongue meant more than just calories. It was a moment of control in a world where you had very little. It was a reminder that you were still alive, still able to choose something that tasted good, or at least felt good, even if tomorrow was uncertain. The legacy of medieval junk food. In some ways, not much has changed. We still want food that's fast, cheap, and portable. We still accept a certain level of risk in exchange for convenience, though today it's more likely to be processed additives than diseased pork. We still crave sweetness, often in quantities that would shock a medieval cook. Our modern fast food chains, street vendors, and food trucks are the descendants of the cook shops along the Thames and the stalls on Bristol's Cook's Row. Would you eat it? If you were dropped into a medieval marketplace right now, would you buy a meat pie? Would you trust a honey fritter from a street stall? Would you risk drinking ale poured from a barrel that's been sitting in the sun for 3 days? The truth is, most of us probably would. Not because it's safe, but because hunger and curiosity are powerful forces. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the human appetite for quick, tasty, and slightly dangerous food is eternal. In the end, medieval junk food wasn't about flavor or even about quality. It was about survival wrapped in pastry, faith baked into bread, and the promise, however small, of pleasure in a hard and uncertain world. And maybe, just maybe, that hasn't changed at all. If you enjoyed this journey into the streets and kitchens of the Middle Ages, give this video a like, hit subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss the next story from history's darker corners. Now I want to hear from you. If you could try just one medieval junk food, would you go for a honey-drizzled fritter, a warm pretzel from a monk's hand? Or would you dare bite into a meat pie knowing what might be inside? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them all and I'm fascinated by the choices you make.